So, the question of land in South Africa is a sensitive one, at least in terms. It involves politics, emotions, the polarization of the country along racial lines, the splitting of urban and rural communities. And the question today is, has the governing party, that's the ANC, been enough in its efforts to try and see to this issue being solved? In fact, they've been under pressure to speed up land reform and redistribution. Just recently, Minister of Agriculture, Land Reform and Rural Development, Togo Didiza, announced that close to 900 farms comprising 700,000 hectares of vacant state land will form part of the government's contribution to land reform in South Africa. Yet, at the same time, we're seeing a rise in land invasions and violent evictions as the demand for housing escalates. Analysts have warned that the land question has been based towards agriculture or biased towards agriculture, while the need for urban land goes unresolved. Now people are asking how the process will roll out, who is entitled to redistributed land, at what scale, and for what purpose. For more on this now, let's bring in Ruth Hall. She's a professor at the Institute for Poverty, Land and Agrarian Studies with the University of the Western Cape. Prof, thanks very much for your time and welcome to the AM Report. We'll unpack these various issues in just a moment. As a start, on what score do you reckon we should be judging how well government is dealing with this? Is it a matter of trying to gauge how much of the issues on the national agenda, or trying to track how much ground has been covered in order to see this process through?
Well, one way in which one could assess government, if you were to mark government on its performance over the past 25 years or so, in 1994, the ANC said in its election manifesto that it would aim to redistribute 30% of white commercial farmland within the first 5 years. That was its initial target, to do pretty much a third of the commercial farming land within the first 5 years. Where we stand now, after just over 25 years, is around 10% of commercial farmland. So, just in quantitative terms, there's a problem, but I think that everyone in the country knows that it's not just a matter of how much land, it's which land, has it gone to the right people, and have they had the support so that they could use the land to improve their lives. And I think that across all those areas, there are major concerns. And I think that what happened 2 years ago in 2018, the EFF, and then supported by the ANC, passed a motion in Parliament to review the Constitution, to relook at the property clause and provisions around expropriation and compensation. That sparked a national debate. And I think that what we saw is that people from all walks of life felt that the land issue, in a sense, it hasn't been resolved, but it's not just about who wants to be a full-time farmer. It's a more fundamental question that people were saying, this is incomplete decolonization. We don't feel that justice has been done. Apartheid still exists as long as we haven't dealt with the land issue. So I think that we need to look at it in a variety of ways to understand why it means so much to so many people across this country.
Yeah, and that really sort of preempts the question I was hoping to get to eventually. It's certainly an issue that's, if you like, unearthed, for lack of a better term, and excuse the pun, some of the underlying issues in the country, right? So the racial tensions we've seen in places like Brackenfell and Senegal, but it's also brought to the fore again issues around the housing backlog that's really plagued the country for years now. How do we begin approaching this meaningfully such that we're not overwhelmed by the multiplicity of these problems?
Well, firstly, I think that land is a fundamental question of who owns this country, who has what rights to this country, who can feel secure in their home in this country, who gets criminalized because they don't have somewhere to live in this country. So I think that, it's not actually entirely Minister Didiza's responsibility. This is something that every local government has to be dealing with. How is it using its own land? How is every parastatal using its land? How are the police responding when people are faced with evictions on farms? So many parts of government are responsible for this issue. And I think that one of the difficulties is that we have actually, in my view, a very progressive constitution that says the government must embark on land reform. It can expropriate. When it expropriates, it does not have to pay a market price. It must always take the principle of transformation and redistribution as its primary consideration. And it hasn't used those powers adequately. It hasn't tested them. The courts have not had an opportunity to even say you can pay no compensation. There has never been a case where the state has said, we don't want to pay compensation in this case. We don't think it's justified. There hasn't been a single case. So, in a sense, we have a whole range of government institutions with responsibilities for land reform. I think that local government is key. 60% of our population is urbanized. We know that the big flashpoints around land access are actually peri-urban. This is where large numbers of people are occupying. They don't have rights to that land, therefore their occupations are illegal. The state's response is typically just a sort of a command and control, a securitization and of the situation, and people get arrested and removed. But the point is that many people during COVID were unable to afford rents in backyard shacks, and this has just spurred on the demand for land in the peri-urban areas. Let's remember, though, that people in rural areas also need land. So it's not an either or, but rather that we cannot assume that the only demand for land is for people to become full-time commercial farmers. In fact, that's a route for relatively few people. Most people want, and all the research shows that there's massive demand for land, but that most people want well-located, small parcels of land where they can be secure, they can have a home, they might be able to grow some food, and there's a whole spectrum. So we need to have policies and processes that make available the right land in the right places on the right terms for people, and to make the whole process of selecting who gets the land a transparent and democratic one, because that's been a key concern. Who's getting the land? Right. It's clear that lots of people need land, but they don't know how it is that other people get the land ahead of them.
Yeah, and in fact, Ruth, I'd say that we haven't gotten to a point where we're able to answer that question satisfactorily, at least not at this stage of, our trying to dissect the situation. Can we have a genuine conversation about land redistribution without speaking about where labor is sourced and how often, the capitalist machine, if you like, has various demands that affect where people move and where they choose their homes to be?
Yeah, well, remember that the basis for land dispossession in South Africa was not just that colonialists needed the land, they needed the labor, they needed cheap labor. So at the heart of our land question is separating people from land to make them available as labor. Now we live in a situation where, in fact, there is abundant cheap labor. People desperately want jobs. They don't have their own land, they want jobs. The jobs are not there. This contrast between jobs and land, well, people have neither. That's the context in which I do think we need to look at the land reform issue. A lot of people want land not only for housing or for agriculture, but they want public space for recreation. They want space to build small businesses. Land can be the basis for many different economic activities. I do think, though, that a key issue that we should remember is that there have been some key moments in the past few years where public participation was provided. There was a parliamentary process headed by former President Kgalema Motlanthe, the high-level panel. There was the Constitutional Review Committee that held hearings around the country, and there was the Presidential Advisory Panel that I was on that also reported. So that's 2017, 2018, 2019. Over these past few years, a whole lot of commitments have been made about policy reform. And my view is that now we have an interministerial committee chaired by Deputy President Mabuza that's meant to be reporting. And I think that there should be a public call for that committee to be reporting regularly on what it's doing about farm worker evictions, what it's doing about insecure rights of people living in communal areas who face eviction because of mining investments or commercial farming investments, what it's doing about speeding up the restitution process for all the people waiting for their claims. So, right now we've recently had an announcement that the expropriation bill process has been picked up again. The bill is in Parliament. The expropriation bill is an important step forward. It clarifies government's powers in line with the Constitution as it stands, and provides that where it's just and equitable, there can be no compensation, but where it's just and equitable that there should be compensation, there must be. But, we've been waiting for this for a long time, and I think that we're going to see two processes rolling out in Parliament now. There is the expropriation bill, and there is the review of the property clause. They're happening simultaneously. But I think that what everyone wants to know on the ground is, while these processes happen, government can still be taking action. It doesn't have its hands tied, so it should be moving forward.
Right. You spoke about government taking action. In fact, Land Reform Minister Tokoto Diza has leased some land for small-scale farmers, but this was actually met with a lot of backlash. Tell us why.
Well, firstly, Minister Didiza on the 1st of October made an announcement that 700,000 hectares of state land would be released for redistribution on a leasehold basis. In other words, government won't give the land, it will provide it to people who will have to pay rent to the state. So this announcement was made. 700,000 hectares, just as way of measuring scale, is quite substantial. It's about half of 1% of the country. And it's about 7 times more than we redistribute every year through land reform. So, perhaps that's a little, perhaps it's actually quite a lot. But the question is, well, where was this land all this time? Most of the state land is, the national parks, conservation areas, or it's the former homelands, or it's being used for various purposes. So in fact, one of the key concerns was, well, if government has the state land, where is it? And government made available a database with the details of the properties. We went through an exercise of mapping that. And what we found was very disturbing, because all this land that it's saying is available, people would assume, oh, this is white commercial, this is sort of commercial farming areas, right? It doesn't have anybody on it. It's just empty state land in the commercial farming areas. But what we found, in fact, is that these were mostly registered farms that were acquired by the state many years ago, mostly about 40, 50 years ago, in the process of consolidating the homeland. So these are actually areas where, in fact, there are lots of people living on many of these farms. They are within some of the boundaries of the former homelands. And the state allocated land to people, but over many years, various people live there. We don't know who lives there now. And the state is now reasserting its rights over that land and wants to allocate it out as a process of land reform. So we are sounding a warning bell that before anything happens, there has to be a thorough investigation who lives on that land. And if people have been living there for years, they have rights. They have rights under existing law as informal customary occupiers of that land. It cannot simply be leased out to other people. So I think that while the state is clearly wanting to, in a sense, show that it's moving ahead with land reform in a context where it has very little budget, it has reduced the budget for land reform. And it's in a financial squeeze, and it's in a political squeeze, and it's bringing out this availability of land for redistribution. My worry is that it's not in the right places. Yeah. More than a third of it is in the northwest, in quite arid areas. But we know over the past few months, where is the great demand for land? It's either around the cities. There's zero land available for redistribution in the Western Cape or Gauteng, none at all in this announcement of state land. So I think that the state is sort of reallocating land that it already had, that we think people already are occupying, that Black farmers, Black communities are living on. Yeah. In fact, it's not tackling the core issue, which is, where do people want land? They want well-located land, close to cities, close to opportunities, and where they want to farm close to road infrastructure in places where there's water. Yeah. So I think, again, government is going with where is the supply rather than where is the demand.
Right. And, Prof, a lot of critics have, and it's a well-rehearsed argument, right, pushed back saying, South Africa runs the risk of becoming the next Zimbabwe if we don't handle this right. In fact, some people say if we go ahead with the redistribution of land, that's the likely outcome. I'm wondering how much of that is an unfounded exaggeration.
Well, firstly, I think we should say, what is a Zimbabwe? A Zimbabwe was a chaotic land reform. It certainly did very quickly transfer a hell of a lot of large commercial farms to local people, to Black Zimbabweans. Some of those were cronies and elites, but a large number of them were not. And there were poor people who managed to, over time, develop livelihoods. There was a devastation of agricultural output. over time, it's recovered in many areas, and different kinds of crops are being sold mostly more into local markets. So for many people, that's a total disaster. For some of the people involved, it's not. So just to say that. But I think that South Africa is entirely different from Zimbabwe in a few respects. And the one is that we are largely de-agrarianized. Most people don't live on land that they would like to farm. They're not wanting more land to farm as a full-time livelihood. Even many people who live in rural areas in South Africa do produce some of their own food, but most of the time they're buying food with social grants or with their cash incomes at supermarkets, and they're buying industrially produced food that comes from hundreds of kilometers away. So I think that the nature of the demand for land in South Africa is different. And the fact that we have equated it only with full-time farming has been a mistake. And people have various needs for land. I also think that what's interesting here is that we have a government that has been very slow and moderate around land reform. It has not tried to push the land reform agenda, in my view. It could have done an incredible amount in 25 years. It's chosen to actually tie its own hands. And when it was challenged from the left by the economic freedom fighters, it has revived this issue, and it has gone with the argument that the constitution must be reviewed, even though the ANC's own view is that the constitution does provide for expropriation without compensation, but it hasn't tried to use those powers. It still hasn't.
Certainly so much to dissect and unpack insofar as this issue is concerned, and that's why it's remaining a big part of our focus throughout the day. But let me thank you for now for always weighing in so eloquently on this issue. Professor Ruth Hall is with the Institute for Poverty, Land and Agrarian Studies at the University of the Western Cape. Thanks very much once again.